this really exciting discussion for this afternoon, which is entitled No Return to Normal. How do we build a new economy? Plenty of people have said over these past couple of months, the corona crisis, that this can't be something that we just dial back and go back into the normal status quo ante as it was. But the big question is, how do we not go back to normal? And so these are some of the things we're going to talk about today. My name is Niccolo Milanese. I'm part of European Alternatives. I'm joined by Zoe Williams from The Guardian, who's going to help me in animating this discussion, which is in part of a series of discussions organized by another European Alternatives and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. This time, we're really thrilled to have two excellent guests, Anneliese Dodds, who's the Shadow Chancellor for the Exchequer, and James Meadway, who's an economist and for a long time has been thinking about new economics. We're going to begin with some opening remarks from Christos Katsoulis, who is the director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in London, and then we'll crack right on with the conversation. So Christos, please, over to you.
Thank you, Niccolo, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us despite the glorious weather, at least in the south of England today. Let me just give you two thoughts for this conversation. I won't say a lot about our foundation. We're doing a lot in the German-British progressive dialogue. I'll put our website and our Twitter handle in the chat, and you can check out for yourself what we're doing. But when we talk about the old normal, and we won't return to that, let me just remind you of what we saw this week going on in the press, because I think it tells us a lot about the old normal. It illustrates particularly well the comings and not goings in number 10, what the old normal is. There are rules, but if you're privileged enough, you don't have to follow them. The main point of reference is the individual and maybe your family, but not the community and not the society. So it's the old Orwellian, we're all equal, but some are more equal than others. So when we're thinking about the new normal, the main question from my point of view is, how can we build an economy where the main principle is caring for each other in every sense of the word, caring about the community, the society, the environment, but also people in other countries, which brings us to the process of Brexit, and I won't delve into that. And the second thought is, this virus has shown us in rare clarity what is wrong with our society, what is essential, who is essential in our societies, what are the weaknesses, and how deeply unfair things still are for many people. And many of us believe on the progressive side that that's enough. We know now what's going on, so that's enough for triggering change. But I don't believe in this kind of virus determinism, and therefore I hope that we get a lot of answers, maybe a blueprint or a roadmap, as Europeans love, from Anneliese and James, to what can we build out from this clarity in that moment. Enjoy the conversation, and thanks so much.
Thank you. So, I mean, if we could start by situating ourselves in the economic context we're in. James, can I just ask you how bad you think this crisis is compared to previous crises that we can all remember, and maybe crises going back before those?
Well, thank you for the invite to speak, and I'll just say a few quick things on that question. I mean, look, probably 2 months ago or a month ago, it seems like time is slightly distorted over the last sort of period that we've all been in lockdown. I think people were talking that this would be comparable to the Great Financial Crisis, and that this would be the sort of where you would get to on, like, this is a really serious crisis. And then if you got carried away, you might say it's Great Depression. And of course, the truth is, and it should have been obvious from the start, it's significantly worse than both. It's easily worse. I mean, just the GDP figures that we now have for the last sort of month or so, and the projections over the rest of the year, which we can take or leave, really, in terms of economic forecasting at this point in time. It's never the most reliable guide to the future, and with something like this going on, it's always going to be a little bit, subject to severe caution, I think, if you're trying to use it. But even just looking at the GDP figures, this is much, much worse than the Great Financial Crisis of 2008 to 9. And you can do the same exercise with the Great Depression. It's worse than the Great Depression in terms of what's happened to Britain in a fairly short space of time. Britain wasn't as affected by the Great Depression as some other places, simply because it was already quite depressed. There was already great chunks of the country that were, if you read Orwell, the road to Wigan Pier, and that had been the situation in a lot of the sort of the depressed areas for a long period of time. But nonetheless, it's easily worse than both of these crises. And the reason it's worse, I think you have to get to the heart of what has happened and why this is such a dramatically severe crisis. Probably the worst, in fact, it is the worst for as long as we've had industrial capitalism, at least. And it contains the germ potentially being, even more dramatic than this. We don't know if there will ever be a vaccine. We don't know if immunity that people get once they've had one round of COVID-19 actually lasts. If the common cold, you have immunity for a bit, it goes away and you get it again. If that's the case, the virus becomes endemic. So everything changes, right, in a really obvious sense there. But parking that to one side, the reason it's so serious right now is that unlike the great financial crisis, 2008 to 9, unlike the Great Depression, unlike basically most crises that we've seen, certainly any I can think of in the last 200 years, let's say, this is one that directly impacts on the real economy. In other words, it directly impacts on work and how people do work and where they can do work and under what conditions that work is performed. So if you take the great financial crisis, the clue's in the name. It's a crisis that starts in the financial system. It starts in the big banks, particularly in America, and spreads everywhere. It then turns into a crisis of the real economy because you get lots of unemployment, people out of work, wages fall. Same with the Great Depression. It's basically several stages of a financial crisis that turn into a crisis of the real economy, a very, very deep crisis of the real economy. This is the other way around. Because of the need to impose lockdowns, which, to be absolutely clear, are completely necessary. This is the right thing to do. If you're confronted by a virus like this, where there is no vaccine, there's no immunity ready existing in the population, where it's very infectious and has a high rate of mortality, particularly for vulnerable groups, then you have to do something like this. But the impact is to then not just change how we all live our lives, but to change how and when we work. And that's a massive shock. And from that shock, from this attempt to pull people out of how they normally work, the shock ripples out everywhere else. Because if you're not working, you have less to spend. If you're spending less, or indeed you simply can't go out to spend, suddenly the shops you spend in are hit by it. And if they're hit by it, they look to get rid of staff. And if they're getting rid of staff, they won't spend as much. And the thing ripples out. And then it turns into a financial crisis, which we can see glimmerings of already. So it's incredibly serious. I'll just wrap up, and I think there are sort of probably four things coming out of this in terms of looking slightly ahead, without saying too much of what we might want to do about it. The first is that much of what's happened to the economy in the last sort of few months has been an acceleration of trends we've already seen in the last decade. The process of deglobalization, the fact that world trade has collapsed, which it did in 2008 to 9 in that crisis as well. Globalization had already, in some senses, been pulled into reverse. There had already been a much lower rate of growth of world trade in the last decade than in the previous 3 decades. World financial flows across borders were down 65% last year, before this crisis, on 2007. So there'd been a retrenchment of the global economy. This has accelerated that. And it's not just the immediate shock where suddenly you can't trade as much. Looking ahead, if you read the Financial Times, The Economist, it's all the talk is about how do you reduce global supply chains. So it's deglobalization has accelerated. The presence of the state, 30 years of neoliberalism where you're basically told we've got to roll back the frontiers of the state, government has to get out of the way, no role for government in the economy. After 2008, with the crisis in, the government steps in to prop up the banks. And if you look everywhere, the government is more heavily involved in the economy. The reappearance of industrial strategy right across the world. This is a huge acceleration of that. And it's unlikely, again, if you saw the Financial Times this morning where Rishi Sunak, of all people, is talking about job creation schemes and this sort of thing, the state, I think, is going to be an increased permanent presence. The third one is the role of data, which accelerates after 2008. We see the explosion of social media, of Facebook, of Amazon, of the digital giants. They have moved into this crisis in a really big way. Look at the row about contact tracing apps. It's a row between digital giants of various forms. That's what's happening there. The need for increased surveillance of people when they're at work, for instance, immediately imposes a data requirement. If you look at the US stock market, quite incredibly, it's actually rising at the minute, but what's really pulling it upwards, it's big tech, right? Because people are betting on the fact that this is going to be huge in the future. These things were all already there. They've accelerated. The one that's new, and I'll wrap up on this, is I think it's repoliticized the question of work. So for years, we'll basically, you have the economy, it's just a thing that exists, and you go into it and you come out of it, and it's separate from anything you do. Now, suddenly, there's a real question of what kind of work do we value? How is that work performed? What do we do with the people who perform that work? How do we look after them? How much do we pay them? All of that is centre stage. And that, I think, is potentially something quite positive, because that gives you something to hold on to and say, actually, we can use this and think about how we might change how the rest of the economy operates. And I'll finish on that.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe, Anneliese, the question to you would be that the last financial crash, at least, was 2008, 2010 in the UK, and many people would say that the left lost the narrative around that financial crisis. They allowed others on the right to impose what could be called bailout for the banks and austerity for all the rest. In this crisis, which is quite different in its causes and to some extent in its effects, it seems to be crucial that the left and the Labour Party ramps up its attempts to put in place a different narrative, a positive narrative potentially, one that also perhaps makes some links between health and care, coronavirus, the question of work, and other big issues which we're all aware of, like the environment and the environmental crisis, which has already been mentioned in the chat. So the big question I want to put to you is, how can you do that? How can you impose a new narrative coming out of this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's really, really good to be with you all. Thanks so much for the invitation. And I'll be quite brief because I know that we're already slipping a little bit behind the really well thought through schedule. I mean, I suppose the first thing that I would say is that we've got to create that narrative, because Christos was absolutely right. There is not some deterministic shift towards left politics as a result of this crisis. It could go in a very different direction. I think the first thing we have to do is, in talking about the new normal, make it clear that we're talking about security for people. Because actually, when I talk to my constituents about this, a lot of people are desperate to get back to what they would describe as life before this. Even with all of its faults, they viewed it as better than where we are now. So I think we can't be painted as somehow wanting damaging additional disruption on top of what's happening. Instead, we're saying, no, we want people to be secure into the future, especially in a way that they haven't been during this crisis. And clearly, I mean, I agree with a lot of what James said. This has shown up so many of the fragilities in the UK economy. The fact that a quarter of UK families didn't even have £100 in savings when this crisis started has meant that if there is somebody who loses their job, or there is a radical change to people's working circumstances, that has an absolutely enormous impact. Obviously, very large numbers of people coming into contact with the social security system in the UK for the first time and having quite a shock while they do so, and realising quite how bad it is at protecting people. So I think that we've got to put security at the heart of what we're talking about, people's security in terms of their families, their communities. So that's got to be at the bedrock of what we talk about. But then I agree with James. I think we need to be talking about the nature of work. And obviously, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, started to get into that discussion a bit, talking about those who had been last before, the incredibly poorly paid hospital porters, the people who work in so much of our NHS are outsourced staff a lot of the time, who've not been provided with the protection that they need, often Black and minority ethnic workers who've been appallingly hit by this disease. And I think that discussion is one that people are engaging with anyway in their homes. They are talking about this. They are talking to those, supermarket workers and public service workers, and realizing the value of that work. So I think that will change. But I think the big lesson as well that I suppose I would take from what happened with the global financial crisis was, first, that some people wanted to accept some of the right's narrative and felt that by doing so, we could then move on and have some space to put forward our proposals. Well, that didn't happen, because as soon as we accepted claims that crisis was caused by public debt, when it clearly wasn't caused by that, we got into a self-defeating circle where we could be blamed for that crisis, which was obviously caused by problems in the global financial system and a lack of regulation. So we can't accept any part of that narrative. We need to be, I think, quite confident in what we're setting out instead. And yeah, I think that, we see some of the beginning architecture of that now. And we've got to be clear, I think. Some would say, well, isn't the right slightly moving on to the left's ground here, with big investment in public services, for example, support for different businesses. But what's really missing is a view of government as a responsible actor, that when, if you look at aviation, for example, in the UK currently, complete mess, very large numbers of people losing their jobs, different airlines fighting against each other, different airports potentially closing. Now, there will need to be change in that sector. There's got to be, because of the climate crisis. There needs to be change. But what's happening is completely disordered. There's no plan, there's no strategy from government. We can't have that laissez-faire approach again. And that's where I really think we've got to be very, very clear. We've got to find the right language to talk about that, so that people can connect with it. Because if it's too academic and talking about intervention, etc., it's got so much baggage. We need to find a new way for talking about these ideas, I think.
I mean, I agree that no bailouts without change, and no bailouts without things in place to ask for. This is a really obvious ground for the Labour Party, and it's ground which Elizabeth Warren is on. It's ground which economists internationally are collaborating on. I feel like part of the rollover to austerity the first time wasn't because the Labour Party wanted to roll over to austerity. It was because there was a kind of critical confusion in the central message. They didn't want to look like the people opposed to saving money, because they didn't want to look like the profligate party. So they had to support a huge number of conservative measures in order not to look profligate, because they weren't prepared to take on the profligacy narrative. And my worry now is, exactly as you pinpoint, a lot of people want things to go back to normal in the sense that they want to not be frightened anymore. But how do you avoid, and maybe this is something that is quite difficult to answer as the party of opposition, and James could consider, how do you avoid, frightening the horses, i.e. saying you can't go back to normal, while at the same time cracking open this as a space of possibility rather than retrenchment?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I have a first go at that, and then James,
sure.
do come in. I mean, I think first of all, it's about pointing out quite how unprepared our economy and labour market and public services have made us for this crisis. And I think the international comparisons show that in spades. And my goodness, I wish that we weren't where we are now. I mean, we could talk about this a lot, obviously, but you see what's happened with everything from the production of protective equipment, where we've not had the industrial coordination that we should have had at all. Actually, when we talk about kind of profligacy, some of the ways that the government has just reached for very, very large firms to work with, when if they just used local government from the start for testing, for example, and tracing, we would have been in a very, very different situation. Just delay upon delay upon delay that we've seen. I think that clearly indicates that there were major problems there. And as I said, so many people themselves are directly experiencing that kind of insecurity that they've never experienced before. So I think we need to make sure that their circumstances really are talked about as much as possible. I find often after the financial crisis, when I was talking to people on the doorstep, people would say things like, I'm really struggling, and I just think if I could just get a bit more money, then maybe I might be able to get out of this situation. And it was very individualized.
Yeah.
And we've got to show that this is not an individual problem. It is much more of a collective problem. Now, actually, I think very sadly, and again, I wish we weren't in these circumstances, the fact that unemployment is going to be pushing up to 9 or 10% will mean that there will finally be more of a focus on those labour market issues, I think, than there was after the financial crisis. Because, we know that living standards have been stagnating in the UK for 10 years. But I think in many cases, people out, kind of in their homes, in their workplaces, thought it was more just something to do with them and their bad luck, rather than a problem cutting right across the UK. I don't know, that would be how I would get into this maybe, but I don't know, James, what would you say?
Well, I'd agree with much of that, and also something you said earlier about the idea of security and unpacking what that means and how people appreciate it, because there's something here that's happened over the last few months, I think for a lot of people, their understanding of what security is and how an economy might provide this has shifted quite dramatically. That it goes from being security is you have a house and everything else is sort of maybe out there somewhere, a job, and that's it, to suddenly there's a whole load of very obvious big social things that we all rely on, and they're really important and they need to be funded. And I find it, I mean, just touching on that, I find it, there's people asking questions about Tories and austerity. I find it unconvincing to say the Conservative Party will suddenly lurch back into doing austerity straight out of the back of this, right? I mean, cynically, they need to hold on to a whole load of people who voted for them last time round, who, you know, in traditionally Labour places, who frankly are not going to be supporting austerity anytime soon. That's the pressure from the backbenchers. The bigger one is just this social impact of seeing the value of a well-funded public sector, to be blunt, and how essential it is. And to turn around and say, actually, we're going to impose a pay freeze on like all these nurses, it's just, it's politically unconvincing, quite apart from, you know, a broader sort of strategy for rebuilding the economy, which I think Rishi Sunak is now laying out, which is going to involve heavy state intervention. And the arguments we're going to end up is, what is the government going to do, rather more than should there be more government? And that's difficult potentially for people on the left for the last 10 years, because really the argument austerity was there should just be more government, right? You have governments in power just say, make government less, and you say, we don't want cuts. Now, if you've got a government in power, which is not on the left, it doesn't have a great concern for social justice, for the environment. I mean, Boris Johnson talks about it, but let's see. It's more challenging to say, actually, this is what government should be doing. And that, I think, gets you into a story, exactly as Anneliese said, about trying to get a narrative around, you know, can we have a caring society? How does government fit into this? What is it that we really value? I think is quite an important thing for the left to start talking about. And you can see some of that happening already. I found very interesting what the New Zealand government has done with a wellbeing budget and trying to shift the conversation away from just GDP and, you know, these slightly abstract numbers. I mean, GDP's risen for the last 10 years. Most people's wages have fallen, right? So it's already a bit useless. So we can build on stuff like that, you know, have a more sophisticated discussion about the economy, not as something separate from us, but it's something that we create, and therefore we can create it in a different way. And that, I think, is involves unpacking some of the issues around security and people not wanting this situation to continue, but also, I think, a real desire not to go back to some of the worst parts of what we had before.
Yeah,
I guess that there's a tricky unpicking. On the one hand, for an opposition party to be pointing out that seems to me that the Tories haven't totally turned their backs on austerity and some of the policies associated with it. If we look at, there's no reversal on the cuts to legal aid. There's nothing being said about student debt or student fees. We could say that the Tories have imposed austerity on the London Underground with the conditions that were imposed for its support. So on the one hand, there's still austerity going on. On the other hand, there's this kind of return of the state and the idea that the Tories are trying to provide a sense of security. But as already been mentioned a little bit in your remarks, Anneliese, the way that the crisis is affecting different groups is very differentiated by those different groups, and also arguably territorially across the UK. So perhaps you could say something a little bit more about, on the one hand, how you see the Tories turn away from a previous narrative, and on the other hand, perhaps where you see the holes in their current strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel that there has been that shift necessarily in many areas, and I think it's quite important that we're clear about that. And, you know, obviously we're doing what we can to try and get the government to change policy. You know, we're not just criticising it, we're saying, look, here are ways in which you can fix things that are not working. And actually, if you look at the situation for people who've already become unemployed, I mean, yes, there have been some changes to universal credit, but they're still far, you know, well behind where people need that support. And, you know, it's not covering people's housing costs. I'm sure we'll come on to that later. You know, there's still the approach towards assessing people's means as well, which is really holding up the system. You know, initial support is just in the form of a loan rather than a grant, all this kind of thing. So in social security, I would argue we're really not in a very different place actually than where we were before. And suddenly, as I said before, huge numbers of people are coming face to face with that, and they're pretty shocked to see the minimal amount of support that they're receiving. And that's why I think, you know, so much of the discussion in the UK is focused around different gaps in the economic packages, is because, you know, if, for example, you're self-employed and you're not covered by the self-employed scheme, then you're going to bump right down onto very, very inadequate universal credit. So that has got to be dealt with. I think also we see the same patterns around passing responsibility and blame onto other actors. You know, we're seeing that now with local authorities. So initially, we were told there would be burden sharing. That was the phrase that was used, that, you know, we would really have the costs of local authorities being backed by government, you know, that they could just go ahead. Big change now, actually, and being told, well, you know, you'll have to justify why you can't, for example, sell some of your assets to be covering this. Well, of course, the problem is lots of local authorities in the UK use those assets to be able to fund essential services. So the blame being passed on to those actors. And, you know, while I welcome the fact that we're going to have now finally some learning from public health experts around some of the, you know, test, track and trace infrastructure, and delivering that from local authorities, I really worry that if that doesn't operate necessarily as well as it could do because of a lack of resource, we might then just have a blame game from central government saying, well, look, it was local authorities' fault, rather than recognising the fact that it was due to inadequate resourcing. So I don't think that we can accept that, you know, that there is adequate support there. There isn't. But there's also another point that we've got to be clear about, which is to question, has there been good value for money actually around a lot of this? You know, this will be something that will be picked over into the future. Certainly it's something that I've been looking at, that our shadow cabinet office colleagues have been looking at. You know, we've seen some very large contracts made with very, very large private sector players. And in a number of cases, the delivery has just not been there. And that's been an enormous problem because it's held up our response. So I think, you know, there's two aspects to this. There's both, you know, the support hasn't always been there when it's needed to be, but also, you know, that we've seen quite large amounts of money going to parts of the private sector who haven't delivered here.
Yeah, I mean, if we can take on that large amounts of money point, we've seen the state take over as this major player in the economy from a government which kind of really was minded to roll it back as far as it could. And now a huge number of people are actually employed by the state effectively. But states' intervention in markets is not always good. As you point out, if they outsource everything to these giants, then, you know, they're just intensifying effectively a rentier economy. The IPPR has a study on this, and the kind of rentier effects of COVID, the plausible rentier effects of COVID. Now, how, you know, in a sense, if the Conservatives are going to turn into kind of major Keynesians all of a sudden, how do you make sure, and how do you kind of tilt that so it's not just intensifying a power imbalance that was already there before? Maybe, James, you want to take that as a kind of, from a theoretical point of view.
Okay. I mean, the first one is, I think the Conservatives' kind of Keynesian turn, if you like, it was already there, which it was their programme in the election was already quite an expansion of government investment. I mean, £100 billion was the figure they were using then. Boris Johnson had already declared an end to austerity. I mean, every Prime Minister from Theresa May onwards had declared an end to austerity. Boris Johnson put a bit of money into it, set a floor to the thing. But Anneliese is absolutely right. That doesn't mean the provision now is adequate. It's at the end of 10 years of cuts, first. And second, I think the other issue on that one is that I think it's unlikely we get a return to generalised austerity out of this, at least not in the immediate future, but selective austerity. So, you know, you go and squeeze London quite hard because, lo and behold, London isn't really voting Conservative. That level of cynicism being applied, and probably some really unpleasant, I can well see this happening, some really unpleasant, you know, basically sort of racialised elements, more racialised elements to austerity creeping in as part of that, as a sort of reshaping the state. So government being bigger and doing more things over here doesn't mean it does more over there, but the kind of state capital fusion, if you like, this congruence of interest between the state and private capital. I mean, it's always built in. PFI, lots of big city firms quite like PFI because it was just government handing over money to them. They made a lot of cash out of it, right? The government intervention isn't always disagreed with by private businesses. You can often quite like it. If you happen to win the government contract, then this is a really good thing. Laurie McFarlane wrote a very good piece for Open Democracy talking about China and authoritarian capitalism, about the way in which you can get these two things coming together. And then the challenge for everybody else is, how do you subject that coming together to any kind of scrutiny? I think you can already see a degree of low-level what appears to be a sort of low level, for want of a better word, corruption around distribution of contracts and things. And I think it's going to be absolutely incumbent on any opposition to really start to drill in, to get into some quite detailed discussion about where is that money's going, who is making these decisions, how is this power of the state now being used? Not just we should use the power of the state, but where is it going, what's it doing?
Yeah.
The word rentier economy has been used by Zoe and just earlier on. Oh, you're back, Anneliese. You were talking about also housing policy. So I want to ask a question about Labour's rent policy, because it's received some praise for its opposition to evictions, the Labour Party, during the corona crisis. But on the other hand, the idea of a 24-month repayment period for renters has been criticised as appearing to prioritise landlord incomes over renters' rights. And so this is a bit of a question about how Labour is prioritising different groups around its support. So how would you address that?
Yeah, well, I think the priority's got to be, just as, you know, when I was talking about people who've become unemployed for the first time, the priority surely has got to be those who are really at the sharp end of this crisis, those people who in many cases were struggling before, but who now are in potentially very, very dire straits. In the context of housing, it's those people who could be likely to be evicted. And so that is where our policy is focused. First, saying that the local housing allowance needs to be upgraded so that it would cover the cost of people's housing. I know this sounds like a pretty obvious point, and in lots of other countries that's where the social security system is, but in the UK, just getting up to 30% of the average rent has been an enormous struggle for us to push, as well as other campaigning groups. And finally, we got there in terms of universal credit support. But we said, look, this needs to go much, much further. It needs to go up to the average. Otherwise, you'll have people becoming unemployed with no other income who otherwise just will be facing eviction. You know, there's no other outcome from that. So that's the priority. That's what we set out as part of that policy. It seems to have been kind of a bit lost in terms of what the kind of extended period would be for evictions. But that's the critical thing. But I would just say that's allied with very much an awareness of this question about who is being protected during this crisis. And, you know, I've said a number of times, as we come out of this, and, you know, again, we kind of don't want to repeat the discussion we just had about the aftermath of the global financial crisis in the UK, but we know that actually the very, very best off people were protected through that crisis in many cases. They actually saw their income tax reduced, inheritance tax reduced, you know, all these other taxes reduced that are paid overwhelmingly by the very best off people. And the low income people, middle income, saw their income stagnating over time. Low income people actually reduced substantially. Now that means that after this crisis, we need to have a new settlement around who is actually going to be contributing, and it will need to be those with the broadest shoulders. And that's something that I've been totally clear on. So, you know, can we deal with all of that in the throes of designing some of these interventions right now? I would say it's quite hard to do that, actually, without ending up in some anomalous situations. And, you know, somebody who owns a yacht being taxed, or a very big one, I should say, you know, being taxed less than somebody who might rent out a house and who's a taxi driver as well. You know, it seems a bit strange. But we've got to sort that out for the future. You know, we've got to deal with that question.
I think part of the problem with Labour's announcement on renters and how they would be given 2 years to pay back any arrears was that people felt that everybody was going to have to take a haircut at the end of this, and none of us knew how big that haircut was going to be or who would take it. So it sounded like Labour was protecting landlords in advance of the bigger discussions that were happening. Now, I can see that this is a really challenging thing because you can't keep out of the discussion, but also it's very difficult to say who, you know, you can't just say, okay, we'll protect people in a descending order of wealth, so that, you know, the less money you have, the more you'll be protected from the coming recession. But surely some kind of structure has to be, surely that has to be the organizing principle.
Well, yes, it absolutely does. And that's why having that social security based support in particular, which we do not have currently to help people with their housing costs, why having that there and then a very strong push for a more progressive tax system is critically important. But, you know, as I say, trying to design that into some of these interventions, also with a government that, you know, okay, has shifted on some elements when we have encouraged them to do so, but has not been willing to take that kind of active intervention. You know, to be honest, as I said before, the people that I'm focused on are the people who could end up being evicted. That surely has got to be the priority, and trying to push government to do something for them as quickly as possible. And, you know, personally, I don't see how they can justify during this crisis not raising that support to cover people's average housing costs. I just don't understand how government can do that. I think it's totally illegitimate.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, Niccolo.
No, go ahead, Zoe.
Well, I mean, it is a huge challenge at once, because obviously you've got the Conservatives rowing back from austerity. So you can't just say they're austerity and we're anti-austerity, but they're rowing back from austerity in quite a dishonest, and maybe it's not dishonest, maybe they genuinely don't know what they're doing. You know, it's quite fits and starts. One minute they've got all the money in the world, and the next minute they make these incredibly parsimonious decisions. So it's quite hard to, the tendency would be to track those inconsistencies and those kind of, and that kind of more minute element of where their thinking is. But if in the absence of any clear sign of whether they're thinking or just reacting like a kind of a government amoeba, is very difficult to know whether you should let that be the kind of framing, kind of the frame for your own development of a narrative. You know, we talked earlier about how legal aid fees were still in play. The TfL decisions are incredibly kind of austerity heavy. Is there a sense that that Labour thinking is kind of developed enough to do its own, to kind of come out with its own programme without actual without talking about where the Conservatives are, because it's sort of pointless talking about?
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I think, if I'm honest, right now, I don't think the public really want the Labour Party to be focused on a lot of work around developing what our mature policy programme will necessarily be for the next general election. You know, I do think that they want to have an opposition which is pushing as hard as possible for people to be protected economically, but also for us to finally get more of a grip on this absolutely horrendous disease. And, you know, I think that has to be the priority right now. You know, obviously, as we move forward, there will be a different balance once we hopefully get beyond this crisis. But, you know, if there are things that we can do now to try and get people to a better place, you know, as I say, I think that pressure around local housing allowance did eventually bear some fruit, you know, but we need to go much, much further in terms of getting it to the average. And, you know, there are other areas where we've seen some change because of that pressure, and I think we've really got to keep that going. You know, I think that's what people are looking to an opposition to do.
And James, as somebody who's more external to the Labour story, but still very much, you know, in it, what do you agree with that?
Well, basically, yes. I mean, look, on our conventional timetable, we're still over 4 years away from the next election, right? There is not much use in setting out your stall now for an election in 4 years' time, particularly under current circumstances. I mean, frankly, if you look at the last sort of 4.5 years, 5 years, if you could predict where we are now and then be able to say this is what a programme that would fit right now, that will work in 4.5 years' time, I think that would be a bit of a stretch. And frankly, I mean, just speaking from the experience of the last 5 years, people sometimes have a slightly odd interpretation of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party. We really didn't say very much until we were hit with an early general election, and then we didn't say very much until, you know, you're hit with another early general election further down the line. It's not the case that we just like tablets of stone that Jeremy turned up with, that was all written down. They have a unhappy history in the Labour Party, I seem to remember. But anyway, they're all written down. Here's the policy, and this is what we're going to do. That's not what happened. I think there does have to be a process. Two things, actually. I agree completely with Anneliese. So you hold the gun to account and you find the points that you can push on where you're going to get things you can win. I think that's just absolutely essential. It's just obvious. I think what you're also seeing at the minute is there's a degree of confusion about where the Tories want to go on this. Like the balance isn't entirely set. I think austerity is, in the round, more or less ruled out. And you can see this even on their sort of radical right, the Adam Smith Institute, talking about don't do cuts, just run up more debt. You know, this sort of thing. For now. But where you go out of this, I don't think is set. Now, that's a good opportunity to start to apply some pressure, one part. The other part is are we gradually putting in place the elements you need to win the next election? Are we setting up the longer term conversations we should be having about changing the tax system so it's fairer? Is the really obvious one, because that is a huge task. And it's not something that's just, here's a policy, off you go. It's like you have to build a consensus around doing this. Are we starting to do these sorts of things? Is that going to put in a position to win the next election? That's kind of where you need to be, I think.
Yeah.
I want to just remind everybody in the audience that we're going to try and leave plenty of time for questions. So we're going to ask maybe one or two ourselves and then open up to questions. So do think of them and post them in the chat, and we'll leave plenty of time for them. I want to ask what maybe is quite a naive question, but this Corona crisis has revealed plenty of latent tendencies in our economy, and one of them could perhaps be summed up as the more essential your work is, the less you seem to be paid. And my naive question is there something going forward that we can do that reverses that tendency? I don't know who wants to go first with. Go on, Anneliese. You're muted down. Yeah, there we go.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the response to this has got to be, first of all, to ensure that working people are able to organise the trade union movement and actually to do all that we can to try and institutionalise that. I mean, we saw government in the UK eventually kind of led to, shall I say, to put it politely, work with the Trade Union Congress and with business associations to create the furlough programme. Now, they arguably did not work as closely with the trade union movement, certainly with regards to having a settled process around health and safety issues in the workplace. And, you know, unsurprisingly, there's a huge amount of confusion and concern around the situation, you know, whether we're talking about everything from schools to shops and, you know, everything in between. And so I think this is a time when, you know, many people are more aware of the critical role of trade unions than they have been before. And my view is that, you know, kind of puppies aren't just for Christmas, trade unions aren't just for setting up the furlough scheme, they're there to enable that coordination that's been so necessary during this crisis. And when they're not there, we get enormous problems. So I think that's got to be a starting point, because actually the role of trade unions in clearly arguing for that better pay settlement has been critical. You know, as you know, we had that pay freeze before eventually we managed to get the pay freeze for public sector workers, or at least some of them, lifted. And that a lot of that was to do with trade union organising, actually, as well as, you know, obviously labour pressure and pressure from others as well. So I would say that's at least a starter. But I think beyond that, it's also, I think, being quite clear, and, you know, I am nervous. There's a number of understandable pushes from different quarters to say that there should be some kind of a bonus for those who've been putting themselves in such danger and, you know, who've been so courageously, you know, being very close to those suffering from coronavirus and, you know, in many cases catching it themselves. And I think that, you know, I can understand those pushes, but we've got to be crystal clear that this isn't just about a one-off bonus or whatever. This is about a new settlement where, as you say, that work, which is so valuable, is properly paid, but also that people can have a decent life while they're doing that work, that they're not, you know, juggling 2 or 3 different jobs as a security guard and, you know, in retail or whatever it is, that they can actually see their kids, they can have a decent life. And I think people, again, they're thinking more about a number of these questions now. We've got to do all we can to raise them to the surface, really.
And James, do you have anything to?
No. I mean, I'd agree with Anneliese about that. I think it's, and I don't think it's a naive question at all. I think it's kind of fundamental. It tells you something quite distinctive about the kind of economy and society we live in, because it's obviously the case. But there are 2 sort of slightly longer term things on that, if we're trying to look out of the crisis a little bit. One is completely right about, you know, the need for more unionisation, for unions to have the kind of voices in the workplace that they ought to have. I think also just more wider sets of rights at work and a bigger definition of what rights at work are. I read a very interesting article recently by a teacher, James McCash, on the right to work from home, and establishing the idea that, you know, people have some more control over how they're working and when they're working. This might include, you know, meaningful reductions in working time, no loss of pay. It might include greater possibilities in working home in some instances. There are all sorts of things that we can start to build out of this. That's one part of it, would be something in that new settlement, I think. The other bit is and this is looking slightly ahead, is that, look, if automation is bearing down on us, what's really striking about automation as it currently stands is a lot of the things that we think are skilled, you know, when we call them skilled, are actually things that computers can do very easily. They can just rattle through them, and that's that, those jobs gone straight off. Anything with maths in it, done, right? That's it. Whereas things that we'd say are low skilled, they aren't, but we sometimes say this, like cleaning a house, looking after the elderly, absolutely something that computers can't do, robots can't do, right? So this reversion, this change, if we're going to see more automation, you can see already that you're going to have a different way of viewing what kind of skills and tasks people can do relative to what can get automated. And if we're going to be serious about making automation work for people, we have to build in that understanding into how we're going to apply automation in different parts of the economy. Of course, with this government, we're just going to get a mad rush all over the place. I mean, Dominic Cummings is mad keen and all of this sort of thing. But there is, I think, an argument for the left to really get into some of the details of how automation happens, under what conditions, and who controls the process.
Yeah. So to get to kind of the obvious yet nitty-gritty aspect of this point in the crisis, obviously Keir Starmer's numbers are incredibly good. The New Statesman had him at a 25% positive rating, even from Conservatives, which is extraordinary. I mean, I can't remember the last time that was true of a Labour leader. Most people agree that his kind of forensic approach is exactly the right counterpoint to Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson is so flaky, and you kind of needed the absolute, the kind of absolute mind that actually mines detail to kind of trip him up. Nevertheless, he's still in that place which a lot of Labour members identified before the leadership election, which was, you know, how does he avoid being Ed Miliband? How is it not Ed Miliband Mark II? You know, how is it not kind of, you know, slightly less Tory than the Tories? And how does he carve a space for himself in which he avoids both those pitfalls of Miliband, of not being radical enough, and the pitfalls of Jeremy Corbyn, which was the minute he said anything, he was dismissed as too radical?
You'll take that.
Yeah, I take that.
Oh no. Okay. Well, look, there's a number of things you can say here. The first one, I do think Keir Starmer's got off to a very good start. There was a, you can, again, I don't want to do too much of a retrospective, but there was a sort of argument in the last 5 years that if you're facing some populist, what you need on your side, you know, some shouty populist, you need another shouty populist, and yeah, maybe, but actually not necessarily. And in fact, somebody's got a shouty populist over here, perhaps needs somebody who's really the opposite. And you can say lots of things about Keir Starmer. I'm not going to call him a shouty populist anytime soon. I don't mean that as an insult, but actually the fact he can do this forensic thing is just perfect at that particular weak spot for Boris Johnson. But this is about more than just you know, personalities or particular characters. There's an issue with Jeremy Corbyn, and I think this is particularly a problem with the 2019 manifesto, where, like, I've kind of gone round and round this, but government spending more money doesn't mean government is more radical and good, right? It could be just government is spending more money. Yeah. At this point in time, this government is spending loads of money. It is right that it's spending money. The furlough scheme is a necessary thing. It is very good that they were forced to listen to the TUC to introduce this. The impact of that furlough scheme is to fix in place a whole load of inequalities. That's what it's doing. Right, so there is a question about how we move out of this into something better. Not a sudden stop, that's disastrous. It's good that the government have wound back from talking about, you know, really hard stops to this, and that again is a result of Labour pressure. But it is fixing in place inequalities at vast expense. So government spending money isn't good. 2019 manifesto was government spending a load of money. Fine, but it doesn't mean it's radical. You can do more interesting things and just go, spend a load more money and maybe it will get better, right? There was more going on there, but this is what it turned into in the election campaign. And I think the question for Labour, for the left in general, is what does a useful radicalism look like that isn't just, we have a problem, get government to solve it. We have to do something better than this. And some of that's going to be like, how do we, for instance, talk about classically different forms of ownership at a local level? How do we have local authorities doing more in their local economies? Preston is the example everyone goes back to, but there are other local councils, Labour councils around the place doing similar, more interesting things. That involves getting people to behave differently, to act differently, to create, for instance, new metrics for government to think about when it's setting a budget, to do different bits of behaviour change, not just spend more money, make government bigger. So I think sometimes the polarity between, you know, radical and credible like that, we have to be a bit more nuanced about what we mean by radical, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that. I think also there's a difference between, I suppose, using the mechanisms that are available around additional funding and taking the critical and hard decisions around, you know, some of the more fundamental questions. And I think that area is one that Keir is very, very well positioned to occupy, because I think he does have that kind of gravitas and trust a lot of the time, that he can be honest with people and say, look, there are difficult decisions that are going to be coming up. I mean, not least, of course, around the climate crisis, where there will need to be that adjustment. And I think there will be difficult decisions that will need to be taken. But, you know, I think it's clear, you know, from having worked closely with him over the last few weeks, that, you know, he is somebody who would be taking those kinds of decisions, very much looking at the impact on people and really thinking through how they're going to affect different communities, you know, different families, different individuals across the country, and how we can get to the best outcome. And I think there's a really big difference there. I know I was going on about this before, but, you know, we just see time and time again, yes, the money going in from government in some cases, but they're unwilling to take some of those hard decisions. I mean, with the furlough scheme, for example, you know, you could think of some parts of the economy which are almost back to normal-ish behaviour. I mean, some aspects of financial services, for example, they're getting back there. So, you know, would it make sense for them when it comes to September to have the same kind of a package around furlough as for, say, a family-run pub? Well, I mean, to me, it's pretty obvious that they shouldn't, right? And I know it's difficult to make a system that is focused on different sectors' needs. And I know there will be boundary issues, but it seems like government just isn't willing to engage in that because it's difficult and because it's, you know, it'd be a bit politically hard to do that. Well, that's not really good enough. You know, we need to be taking those difficult decisions. It's the same with the self-employed scheme, where we've got, you know, the same system applying right across the board, whether you're a hairdresser who could not be back to normal operation for, you know, extremely long time, compared to somebody who's, you know, pretty much, you know, maybe lost a little bit of income, perhaps, you know, 5% maybe, but not more than that, not being completely wiped out. So I think that responsibility, you know, being willing to assume responsibility is, I think, something that Keir Starmer will be able to do and do very effectively. And I think that'll be a big contrast, obviously, with the current government.
I want to come to some of the questions that are in the chat just in a second, but I want to make sure I get in one question, which is very important for Another Europe is Possible, and I think many of the audiences that are listening to us, and it's about Britain's relationship with Europe and Brexit, because even if the Labour Party, for understandable reasons, has chosen perhaps not to focus on Brexit in recent months, and the national conversation has been around slightly more urgent things, Brexit is urgently coming upon us in terms of the negotiations around the future relationship. And so the obvious question to ask, given that this future relationship will have a huge impact on pretty much anything that a future government wants to do, whether it's in the economy, whether it's dealing with the climate crisis, whether it's to do with trade, in international relations, pretty much every aspect of national life. The question is, Anneliese, are you able to give any kind of sketch of what the Labour Party might be pushing for? And perhaps included in that is freedom of movement, one thing that you would prioritise. You want to keep the 4 freedoms, as they call them in EU jargon, together.
Well, I mean, I think we saw around that particular issue actually quite an interesting debate in Parliament and in the media. It wasn't last week, the week before, around the immigration bill, where there was a lot of public concern actually about the impact of the new regime being put forward by government on precisely those people who we've been so reliant on during this crisis, not least those working in social care. So I think, in some areas of this, there is a different discussion that's starting. But I think, to me, it's very clear, or hopefully should be to the current government, that the kind of actors they might have reached out to otherwise to develop strong trading relationships are proving themselves to be potentially quite capricious in their behavior, not reliable. We've seen what's happened with the World Health Organization today, that lack of commitment to internationalism and to multilateralism that's been occurring. And I suppose, from kind of my point of view, and I'm not going to talk for the whole shadow cabinet, that wouldn't be appropriate, but certainly from the economic point of view, I think you're right to an extent, Niccolo. People don't want to be hearing a big discussion about Brexit. Well, that's the last thing they want now. They want politicians to be focused on the current crisis. But I've been saying that if we end up in a situation where we've got a number of businesses that have struggled through this period, with quite a bit of damage to their supply chain, potentially reduced demand, but they've just got through that. They've struggled through potentially to the autumn. And then if we see a, really chaotic process, additional tariffs, additional problems with supply chains, that would just mean, it'll be the straw that would break the camel's back at that stage. So I think trying to take it to those brass tacks really is critically important. And again, it's a question of responsibility. I mean, what we seem to have at the moment around these negotiations is kind of political theatre. It's not a kind of responsible engagement with what's in the interest of our country and our economy and jobs. So that, I think that's the kind of viewpoint that we're taking on this, really.
Okay. So shall we go to questions from the audience? I've flagged a couple just as we were going along so that we'd give everybody a chance to breathe and then post more. A lot of people are asking about universal basic income and whether or not we're sort of halfway there already. It's like a lot of employers are talking about furloughing as a waiting room for redundancy, but I sometimes feel like furloughing is a waiting room for a UBI. Where do you both stand on that, James?
Okay, me first. Well, look, I've been convinced to the use of universal basic income over the last few years. I mean, initially being a bit cynical about it, or a bit suspicious maybe, for a few reasons really. One is that, like, in the event of crises like this, and the sad truth at the minute is we're probably looking at an increasingly unstable world, one way or the other, and more risk. I mean, the rate of epidemics and pandemics is increasing globally. As climate change bears down, there's more of these sort of events will occur. So the need for something that's completely reliable and robust to any big shock that happens, I think becomes quite obvious. I think there's another part of that, which is the desire to build in a flexibility around working, and that clearly working patterns are changing. They were changing already as we're getting into this current sort of crisis. Something that allows and gives a capacity for people to be able to shape the patterns of their work themselves, I think is very important, particularly if that's also part of reinforcing rights at work. And if the two come together, then something that's quite a powerful tool for pulling rights and power back in favour of people who work rather than in favour of people, as we described the rentiers previously. So that's a useful combination of things. And the third one, I think, is just that if you have a universal benefit, you lose this possibility, or at least you very much weaken this possibility of a sort of divide and rule. Like, why was austerity so viciously applied in certain parts of society in the way it was in the last 10 years? Basically because not everybody was getting some bits of payments that the government was making. And if you're not getting it, you're not attached to it. And therefore you can get rid of it very rapidly. People love the NHS because everybody can see that it's useful to them as well as everybody else. It creates a support for the thing. Child benefit is a universal benefit introduced in the mid-1970s, late 1970s by Labour. Controversial at the time because it was universal, but very popular because it's universal. So if you want to build in support for a reformed welfare state and meaningful social support, I think it has to be universalism that's coming in there. So that's my answer.
Anneliese, I mean, I know that it's not Labour policy, so we're not going to hold your feet to the fire on this, but I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of baggage, right, around this, and quite a lot of kind of definitional questions. I mean, personally, I think it's more helpful to talk about the use of conditionality a lot of the time, and where that's appropriate and where it's inappropriate. And I think, particularly currently, we've got a social security system where you have to jump through enormous number of hoops even now, and where you only get a loan after 2 weeks and you don't get any support. So clearly that has got to be changed. I would say also we're in a situation where we're going to have increasing numbers of older workers, many of them becoming unemployed for the first time. And are they really going to be required to have to jump through all the same hoops as the social security system is set up for them? That seems an insult to people's dignity, frankly. So I think, there are big questions about conditionality. And, we know that the kinds of conditionality that have been applied before very, very often just lead to people disengaging and saying, well, I am trying to do whatever it is. I am trying to get work, but I'm not able to because of my disability or whatever. This is just too much stress. I'm just not going to claim for this anymore. That's actually what often happens, rather than it having any impact on people's behavior. It's a really patronizing approach towards people in those contexts. So, to me, should we have less conditionality? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that, that we should have less of it. But if we're going to be saying that we want to move towards one of those kinds of models that many people have put forward, for me, a big question is, I hate to say it, but it is, well, how are we going to fund that, right? Some have said to me, and I think the RSA suggested, well, you could just take the whole social security budget and just use that. Well, the problem is, of course, there are some people who've got much, much, much more expensive needs than others. And, is it really fair to be expecting somebody who is going to find it much, much harder to make any kind of an income, who's got 4 kids or lives in expensive housing or whatever, should we really be saying that they're getting the same as somebody else? And if we say, well, actually there would be a top up, then the big question arises again, where does the money come from? And I think the challenge for me is that, I like a lot of the ideas that people have set out around this with, sovereign wealth funds, for example, providing some of the money, new forms of taxation, etc. But I think, there are a lot of other extremely strongly competing priorities for funds that would come from those elements as well. So, do I think that, just finally to finish off, do I think that there could be a role for some kind of demand boosting intervention at some point, which might involve some kind of uniform payment, maybe related to people's incomes potentially? I think yes, although actually making our social security, not something that fosters poverty, but something that actually helps people will get us some of the way with that anyway. But I think, yeah, as I say, I think it's sometimes more fruitful to talk about conditionality, I would say, rather than all of the kind of baggage and definitional issues that we can get into when talking about this concept.
I want to read out a comment and a question from Pamela Calder in the chat, who said, we need to have a plan for the future which understands the necessary role of bringing up our children, but does not assume that this is going to be done by women. I've not seen this point explored even through the virus, even though the virus has shown how crucial care is, and shown that education schooling is also not valued just for education, but rather for its role in freeing up adults to go to work. This seems to me to be a comment that's going to resonate with very many people watching here. So perhaps it would be interesting to hear thoughts on how also the aspects of unpaid labor that have been shown up in this crisis can be better valorized and distributed equally. Who wants to go with that? For Anneliese.
Will I jump in first? I think that the data speaks for itself, really. There's been some interesting work done by the IFS about, who's still doing the caring, etc. And, ultimately, it's interesting, because more women have been furloughed than men. And I suspect in very, very large numbers of cases, it's the women who are looking after the children. But of course, there's no clear guidance at all or regulation around what's then meant to happen when those women don't have any chance for their children to go to school. Now, that's not to suggest that I think, that we should necessarily be requiring all children to go back to school, because there's big issues around that as well, because of what I said before about, you know, lack of engagement with trade unions and lack of clarity around keeping people safe. But I think this is an enormous issue, and you know, it's really one where I think a lot of parents in general, but particularly women, are really struggling around. And, you know, I would agree with the questioner that this has got to be pushed up the political agenda. You know, the kind of hand waving, frankly, that we're seeing around it is just not acceptable. But I would say also that the point about carers is really, really important. Again, we see from the data that a lot of those who are formally employed in social care in the UK are also carers, quite often in a kind of sandwich way, so both to their children and to an elderly relative as well. So their entire life is consumed with caring for others. And, you know, clearly this crisis has put that into stark relief, because then, you know, the possibility for cross-infection, etc. And only now are people realizing that's the reality for so many people. And, you know, going back to what James was saying, you know, these are skilled roles. They are very difficult. Looking after somebody with dementia for long periods is draining, incredibly hard, tests your patience, and, you know, it's a very, very difficult job.
Did you want to add to that, James?
I mean, I just agree with all of that. I think but the only thing to add, I suppose, is just to underline the point about the really big picture bit of, like, how do we set government policy, and is a measure like GDP really the best way of doing this? Care work doesn't feature in GDP. If you don't pay for it, it doesn't turn up, right? So this is obviously not appropriate. A load of the things that are really valuable, really essential, we don't know how to count properly, and it directly affects the kind of government policies we end up with.
I want to read this question from Richard Marchese Robinson, and partly because we meant to talk about climate a lot more than we actually have. So deforestation both contributes to climate change and increased risk of viruses crossing from animals to humans, as recently noted in Scientific American. Can we build upon this and link the importance of tackling these issues all at the same time? I mean, how do we roll the recovery into, how do we make it a carbon neutral recovery, first of all, and roll it into the Green New Deal agenda? James.
God. Well, I'm glad you raised that, because I think there's a greater awareness around the fact that climate change isn't just one. Firstly, it isn't just one cataclysm that happens. It's a slow process of a lot of things that we appreciate about the world getting worse, frankly, in pretty much any case you care to mention, but also lots and lots of other problems that it throws up along the way. And there's a fairly clear, well-established relationship between increasing numbers of epidemics and climate change by this point, as much as you have a good scientific understanding of any of these things. So it's climate change, deforestation, intensive farming, you know, increased international travel, these sort of sets of things is why this happens. So you have to try and tackle all of those in the round. And I think if we're talking about the Green New Deal in particular, I think we have to be quite careful that we don't end up with something that just says we're going to decarbonize the economy, when actually exactly the other issues like deforestation, biodiversity loss, use of intensive farming, for example, all kind of factor into it as well. Resource use. I mean, we could rapidly decarbonize the economy if we all just went out and changed everything to electric vehicles overnight, but the demands to build batteries creates a huge resource problem, which is itself another environmental risk somewhere down the line, right? So we have to have quite a sort of holistic view of how these things operate. And I think there's also the case that you would want to tie at least some of this into a story about what do we think about care, what do we value in the economy, what do we mean by work? Because it's really obvious. We just had a fantastic demonstration. It's not fantastic really, but it's a graphic demonstration of how changes in the role of work impact on all sorts of environmental goals. Right, the fact that people aren't commuting so much immediately reduces carbon emissions, immediately reduces air pollution. Now, we don't want to have lockdown forevermore. This is ridiculous. That would be ridiculous. But there is something there about changing how people work, and not just seeing Green New Deal as like, it's all about big investment. It's all about chasing some carbon target that doesn't necessarily make much sense to people. How can we pull some of this down to a level that people understand? How can we tie it into a wider story about the kind of society and the kind of economy we want? That, I think, is where we need to get to with the Green New Deal in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I suppose I'd try and chop this into kind of opportunities and challenges, I guess. So I think around the opportunities angle, I think the opinion poll evidence shows us that people are, it seems, more willing now, you know, given that this, I suppose what's happened was kind of an unlikely event, but one which has cataclysmic impact, clearly, with this crisis. I mean, sadly, we do know that climate change obviously is happening. It's not whether it's happening, it is happening. And there's more of a willingness from people to take action now in a preventative manner. So I think the public appetite is there. I think there's also some more coordinative machinery, although I'll come back to that in a minute, around the challenges, in terms of the kind of incredible community activism that we've seen during this crisis, which has been just, I think, quite mind-blowing. I mean, certainly on my council estate, you know, suddenly people are engaging with others. And actually, interestingly, quite a lot of that is focused around public spaces and working together to, you know, to increase biodiversity and protect wildlife and all that kind of thing. And we're suddenly realizing that we value those public spaces, and kind of getting into that broader natural world question that James mentioned. I think also the government has said that it's going to be, or has intimated that it's going to be pushing forward infrastructure spend. So, you know, clearly there needs to be very, very strong pressure around the need for that to be not just environmentally non-damaging, but actually to be placing us at the forefront of developing many of those technologies and for the transition. But then I think they're the kind of opportunities that we've been missing, and which I think this crisis will let us kind of examine and will lead to pressure to fix. So, you know, the lack of industrial coordination around PPE, for example, production of protective equipment, testing and so forth. The fact that, you know, regionally you had those intermediate organisations, you had local authorities, trade unions, business associations, often saying, look, we want to work together to deliver this stuff, and central government not working with them at all, you know, trying to follow just a centralised process. Well, actually, we need to have those kinds of regional and local economic linkages if we're going to deliver that just transition, you know, kind of localised energy networks, localised circular economies, etc. That's going to have to be there, and that's going to have to come out of that better coordination. So big opportunities, I think, there, people thinking about these issues. But then finally, that relationship between government and business. And, you know, I've kind of, and Zoe was talking about this before around conditions for public support. You know, I've been quite clear, we should not be, and many other countries aren't, but we still are, we should not be talking about potentially providing public money to different companies which are not acting currently, or even committing to in the future. And it's got to be that future focus which is critical, not committing to green their operations, but also not committing to pay their people decently, to treat their workers fairly, to use tax havens, all this kind of thing. So yeah, I think both kind of opportunities, but some challenges as well.
I think there's a question here which might be of good interest to some of the audiences that I know Another Europe and also European Alternatives reach out to, which is about the arts and culture sector specifically, which has obviously been hit in a very particular way by this lockdown, and it's by no means clear coming out of the first stage of the lockdown to what extent the arts and culture sector will be able to open up as other parts of the economy open up, and how it might have a durable impact. And so it might be interesting to hear perhaps ideas of Labour Party policy concerning supporting specifically the arts and culture sector over the coming difficult period.
Yeah, I mean, I think this relates to the discussion that we were having around kind of furlough scheme, self-employed scheme, etc. I mean, very, very sadly, it looks like reopenings of theatres, for example, cinemas, music festivals, those kinds of events feel like they're very, very far away. But, you know, we all hope that eventually we will be able to participate again in those kinds of events, although taking on board, you know, James's kind of warnings, which I think are prescient. You know, we can't assume that we will necessarily definitely get to a better position. But that means that having the same undifferentiated approach across the board with the economy is really going to be knocking out not just capacity, but actually a lot of parts of our economy, of our collective life, which people view as, you know, extremely important. And I think, you know, here we need government to be showing some responsibility and some strategy. I mean, actually, in terms of what the UK kind of does economically, you know, our creative industries as well as our universities, actually, interestingly, taking a massive hit from this too. You know, they're very, very important to our economic health. So obviously, I'm working very closely with colleagues about what we can do to support here. I mean, I would say as well that, you know, we need to build on the really incredibly positive stuff that's been happening in the sector. I mean, just kind of a couple of miles away from where I am now, the bigger arts institutions have all been working together to think how they can support their freelancers and their playwrights and their artists, what they can do collectively. So there are new connections being forged through this crisis, which will be critically important, I think, for the future. And then I just say finally, obviously there's going to be a demand question. And I think government needs to be looking at that. You know, once we hopefully are in a position when these kinds of institutions can open safely, you know, how can we be encouraging people to go back into using them, you know, people to experience some of that amazing wealth of arts and, you know, really exciting culture that applies right across the country, maybe for the first time. You know, this could be an opportunity for people to experience that richness, potentially, if government is willing to get engaged.
Sorry.
If you want,
Sorry,
I have another one lined up as well.
Oh, okay. No, okay, you go, Niccolo. I was just going to ask one about Europe, but I'm sure yours is also
Go
about
on.
Europe.
No, go ahead, and we'll perhaps finish with the one that I saw. So go ahead, Zoe.
Well, I mean, a lot of people are worried both about the kind of immediate policy as an opposition party on Europe and just the general slow speed train crash coming towards us, and whether or not we have to kind of brace for it now. I mean, you know, is there any benefit in calling for an extension of the transition period? It looks like Europe's really lost patience with us. Are there any bridges to be built as the government in waiting?
I mean, I think it's certainly important to have those bridges of solidarity, you know, between the Labour Party and our sister parties, and, you know, both in Europe and beyond. And, you know, we've been doing that. It's one of the first things that I did, that Keir did, is making sure that we build those connections from the off, really, and that we can kind of show that solidarity. That is incredibly important. But I would agree with you, Zoe. I think there is a running out of patience, really. I mean, I think at the same time that certainly from counterparts that I've spoken to, you know, that there's no desire to be ending up in a situation that we make more of a mess of supply chains, etc., at the end of the year. So, you know, it's possible that this deadline could pass, and then there may be some kind of a way of, you know, something that's called different being put in place to kind of smooth any transition. But, you know, I've spoken to others who've said, well, no, that's totally impossible. That would never happen. You know, the legalities mean that it's not on the table. But, you know, again, I just feel that we need to, you know, it's very frustrating that we seem to be trapped in this kind of political theatre around this, rather than adopting, you know, a more kind of pragmatic approach, and one more focused on the national interest, really.
I mean, James, you've never been quite the Romaniac the rest of us are. And have you got a more relaxed view?
Well, yes and no, I suppose. I mean, look, if you're in the middle of the biggest crisis in the history of capitalism, with a global pandemic with no real end in sight, because there's no vaccine and no obvious signs of we don't know yet if immunity is long lasting. I do feel like most of the questions kind of reduce somewhat in the sense of bearing down as what's the most pressing thing we face. So there is that. I mean, my own view is that for most of the last period of Brexit up until actually leaving, the threat of no deal was mostly there as a kind of bluff and as a way of scaring people. I think that's actually how the thing's playing out. There is a slight concern that because now things are so bad, you might well have a consideration that things are so bad already that no deal doesn't look so bad on top of it, for instance. You know, if you're already in a massive recession, adding to this with a no deal suddenly doesn't look like such a high cost. And I can well see at least elements of the Tory party would take that kind of view in it. So potentially the risk of no deal moves further further up the list of considerations, but I don't view it as massively likely on the list of things that can happen. I think the approach being taken, frankly, by the front bench is basically about the right one, which is, again, it's this issue of getting into the details, because it's the details that's going to matter on this. It was always the details that really mattered on this, but instead we had a big, fairly sort of fundamentalist row about the nature of our relationship to Europe in total, rather than actually can we think in a more nuanced way about what that relationship might look like. If we're now getting into the details, this is probably a net improvement. But broadly, I'd agree with Anneliese on a lot of this.
Yeah.
Well, coming to the end, so I wanted to ask a question from Celia Wilson, because we've been focusing a lot on policy and what should the Labour Party say and so on. But her question perhaps reflects what many of us as activists feel. It's this: what can we actually do now during a Conservative government in what is quite a difficult semi-lockdown situation where it's not obvious to see how you become politically active? What can we actually do now during this Conservative government as MPs, as local representatives, as left-wing supporters or activists to make a difference? She mentions particularly concerning the EU and climate, but I'm sure the point goes more generally. So perhaps to close off.
Can I just add an addendum to that question, which is, James, something you said earlier. You said we've got, the election is 4 years away. I want everybody to consider, is the election really 4 years away? Because I feel like this is crumbling.
So what can we do now to make a difference, all of us, and is the election really 4 years away?
Yeah, I mean, I happen to think that actually a lot of politics happens at a local level anyway, and that what we all do in our communities a lot of the time is political. And actually, funnily enough, I know Celia Wilson, and she's a fantastic person, an amazing community activist, and I know that actually what she has been doing is political, because it's been about showing a lot of the time the value of community, the value of working together, the fact that people shouldn't feel that they're left on their own around this, that they should be able to count on others if they're vulnerable. And I think, I do think that's critically important, actually. That to me is political work. It might look a bit different, but it still is. And, as I said before, I think some of the kind of organisation that's been occurring has been feeding into a lot of issues around people's immediate environment, around questions about where they live, the big pushes that we're seeing towards sustainable transport happening in different places. A lot of the time that's been, really focused on by these different local groups. I think that is political. And so, yeah, let's make sure that we build on that. And, while we're doing so, let's make sure that we keep these discussions going on and these debates, because I think we've also got an opportunity, particularly to hear from people from across the UK. I've been so many discussions in Westminster. Because they're in Westminster, nobody from outside London's able to participate. Now it's being thrown open, and my goodness, it's so exciting as a result of that. So lots to be getting on with, I would say.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No. Again, I'd agree with that. And also Anneliese stole what was going to be my point that I was going to make, but it's fine. So yeah, look, the local organisation thing has been dramatic. It is a politicising impact. I think the fact that so many people are involved in mutual aid groups, it is both good to be doing this. It's just inherently good, but it starts to raise issues about how are we actually organising ourselves on a local level. I mean, I think one of the things coming out of this is, I don't think the high street's going to survive in its existing form even before we hit this crisis. Right? It's clear that more and more shopping is going online. That's now accelerated massively. So the question about all these spaces, they're basically public spaces, what are we going to do with them? Can we come up with local, on the ground, perhaps working with local authority, perhaps not, solutions to keeping high streets as viable public spaces, repurposing buildings, making things happen on a local level is I think, one part of that. The lobbying and pressuring of MPs, I think, has had an impact over the last week around Dominic Cummings. That can still very obviously take place, and I think particularly for the Tory MPs, it's been a real shift for them. And the final bit is actually Anneliese's point, which is that some kinds of organisation are easier now. Some kinds of education are easier now. Like, we can have a meeting, there are people here from, I just saw some from Wigan, hello, it's my hometown, but there's people here from Settle or Seattle, there's people here from, that can happen in a way that it just couldn't otherwise. There's so much sort of political education taking place online all of a sudden. I think this is having quite a big impact in terms of how people see the world. All of this is contributing to building a movement, I think, out of this. Do I think the election will be 4 years away? It's very hard to see how a government with a majority this size will end up, particularly also a Fixed Term Parliament Act, which I notice is still there, end up in circumstances where it's not going to be there any longer. Do I think Boris Johnson will be Prime Minister going into that election? No, not necessarily. And it's looking increasingly unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that bombshell, no, I'm not muted. On that bombshell, I'm going to draw us to a close. Thank you, everybody. I mean, I can't think how, but I hope we all keep talking about this, because I know there's a lot that went unanswered and a lot that everybody wants to hear more about. So maybe if we all just regroup on Twitter, we can continue these conversations into the coming crisis.
Great. Perhaps while we're all enjoying the great outdoors in the beautiful weather, because not all of us are out in our gardens quite yet, if we're lucky enough to have gardens. So let me also just repeat, thank you very much to everybody who joined us today. There were over 300 participants at different points of today. Thanks very much to Anneliese and to James for taking the time to speak. And there'll be more of these Zoom calls coming up over the coming weeks. And as Zoe pointed out, there's other ways to keep up the conversation in real life, through Twitter and otherwise as we go forward. So have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thanks so much.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.